Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to AlphaBiolabs' latest webinar, The Right Test at the Right Time, drug and alcohol testing for every scenario. So my name's Andrew Priestley, and I'm the Legal Marketing Manager here at AlphaBiolabs, and I'm going to be joined today by my two colleagues, Ashley Friday, who's our Sample Collections Manager, and Sam Evans, who's one of our toxicology reporting scientists. So I'll oversee the webinar this morning. You can see the agenda there. So Ashley will talk to you about the various drug and alcohol testing methods that are available and when and how to use them. She'll also, specifically for drug testing, we'll explain to you the difference between wide window and narrow window tests and why you should consider combining the two. Sam will then cover what's in our user-friendly expert reports. And as part of that, she'll include a couple of real-world case studies, one for drug testing and one for alcohol testing. We'll then conclude the webinar with our Q&A. Quite a few of you asked questions during the registration, so we will answer those questions in the live session. If you think of any other questions during the webinar, then please use the Q&A function to ask as many questions as you want. We probably won't have time to answer them in the live webinar, but we will send you an individual email later on today with an answer. So please feel free to ask as many questions as you want. What you'll see within the webinar as well from both presenters is there's quite a lot of detail and there's quite a lot of tables on there as well. We will be able to send you on request either an electronic copy or a printed copy of our brand new testing options information guide, which will include all the tables that you will see during this webinar this morning. So don't feel you've got to try and write everything down. We can make this information available to you after the webinar. Okay, so enjoy the webinar. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Ashley.
Hello, good morning. Thank you for joining us. So as Andrew mentioned, the webinar is going to be in sort of two parts. So the first part, we're going to speak specifically about drug testing. And then in the second part, we'll cover alcohol testing and the options for that. So we're going to start off by looking at the wide window of drug testing options, what we can do if we want to look back at a longer period of time, which is usually our most requested type of drug test. So the one that we would recommend doing where possible would be to conduct a drug test using a sample of head hair. Now, as recommended by the Society of Hair Testing, head hair grows at an average rate of 1 centimetre per month. And what this means is it allows us to apply a time frame to a drug test when taking a sample of head hair. So we can look back a number of months, we can break that down month by month, and we can provide that as a report so you can look at patterns and trends within someone's drug use. Drug testing is looking for users that have kind of repetitively used over a period of time. So it's not looking at one-off drug use, it is looking at regular drug users. And in order to look at patterns and trends within there, you get options about how you want your report to be kind of written out. So you can opt for an overview of the analysis. You can do month-by-month analysis, or you can do bi-monthly analysis. Now, the options available to you are based on whether your client has sufficient head hair for the testing, so enough length of head hair, and that will dictate what timeframes can be applied. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a look at those three options separately for what you would be able to order if it was suitable for your client. So the first one we're looking at is an overview. So an overview analysis allows you to look at a wider period of time as a whole. So on the screen now, you can see that if you had a client with 12 centimetres of head hair, that would cover 12 months, following that 1 centimetre per month rule. And with an overview analysis, that would be broken down into 4 separate results, each result covering a 3-month period. If your client had 3 centimetres of head hair, for example, that would cover 3 months, and you'd just get the one result for that time frame as a whole. Overview analysis is tended to be used when you maybe already know what the outcome is likely to look like. So you're not necessarily looking at certain patterns and trends specifically, but if you had a client who stated they'd never used drugs at all during that time frame, and they were just looking to prove the test as negative, an overview would be suitable for that type of person, because all you need is that negative result covering the time frame as requested by the court. If you do want to look at patterns and trends, you would be looking to opt for a segmented analysis, segmented month by month. So again, if your client had 12 centimetres of head hair, you could get a 12-month analysis. But with segmented testing, you would get an individual result for each month, so 12 results in total, rather than having 4 results for the 12-month period. Likewise, if your client had 6 centimetres of head hair, it would cover 6 months with 6 results, each covering a month. And what this allows you to do is look at patterns and trends within someone's drug use. So if you had a client who'd maybe used previously, but had tried to reduce the amount that they were using or had started to abstain completely, you would want a month-by-month segmented analysis so that you can see that pattern over time or that reduction over time. And then the third option for head hair testing would be bi-monthly segmented analysis. So this falls in between the two, and this is where we would report in 2 monthly segments. So if you had a client that was being tested for 6 months with 6 centimetres of head hair, you would get 3 results over that time frame. Again, allowing you to look at patterns and trends, but just in a wider time frame per segment. And you'll notice as we go throughout this webinar that the options totally depend on what you're looking to prove or disprove for your client. So it's always worth taking into consideration whether they have head hair, if they do, how long the head hair is, and then which one of the testing options would be best suited, depending on what you're looking at. So that's an ideal situation where your client has sufficient head hair to cover the time frame that you require. Obviously, that's not always the case. So in some cases, we need to look at alternative options. So we can look to test for drug use in body hair, so underarm, chest, back, leg, whatever they've got available to us. But it's important to remember that testing a sample of body hair will look back up to 12 months as an overview. The growth rate isn't as consistent as head hair, so that 1 centimetre per month rule doesn't apply for body hair. So if you did need to look at patterns and trends throughout someone's use, body hair might not be suitable, as it would just be an overview for that time frame of up to 12 months. Beard hair is dependent on length. So once it reached the laboratory, we would measure it and report back as to what time frame we can apply to it. But again, it is only an overview of up to 12 months. So if you did need those patterns and trends, it would be head hair that you'd be looking to test. If you don't have head hair and you don't have body hair, we can also take nail clippings from your client to test for drug use. Fingernails could look back up to 6 months, whereas toenails could look back up to 12 months. But again, both of those tests would be an overview. So always worth considering whether that would be beneficial or whether you'd look for alternative testing. So we've spoken about the wide window of detection. We've looked at looking back over a number of months, potentially up to 12 months if your client has a valid sample. But sometimes we want to look at narrow windows of detection. So we're looking back that far isn't beneficial to the case. So I just thought I'd briefly touch on some narrow window drug testing options. So the first option is to do an oral fluid sample. Now, an oral fluid sample is going to look back approximately 2 days from when the sample is collected. So it is that very, very narrow window of detection. It can be useful in certain circumstances. It's really quick and easy to collect, and it can be sent off to the laboratory and then a report issued. But the important thing to remember is that it does cover 2 days. So it's whether that is what you'd be looking for your client. We can also offer urine testing. Because of the risk with adulteration of urine testing, it does need to be done at one of our walk-in centres. They are based across the UK, and sample collection there is free of charge, but it would need to be done there rather than in your client's home. Urine testing looks back up to approximately 4 days, so a little bit of a wider window than oral fluid, but you can see that it's nowhere near as wide as things like head hair or toenail testing that are looking back a number of months. So again, could be an option if suitable for the situation and for your client. These are the testing options we've just spoken about, but set out in a table and easier to read format. So you've got your narrow window at the top, which is your oral fluid and your urine testing, and then that wider window of detection for the other samples that we discussed. Sometimes people will choose to do combined testing, so combine narrow and wide window. This is because by the time the ingestion of a drug has taken place and it's processed through the body and then grown out and available in the hair sample, that whole process takes approximately 14 days. So if, for example, you took a hair sample today, the report would cover from approximately the start of June to allow for that 14 days from ingestion to be invisible in the hair sample. So some people will opt to do narrow window testing in the interim, just to make sure that the time frame is covered as a whole. So they do complement each other well. It's just whether that's suitable for your client, but something to consider before instruction. So like I just said, some people do choose to combine both narrow and wide window testing. It can help support abstinence monitoring. So if you did have someone who had abstained from use and were looking to prove that, the narrow window of detection would complement the wider window. It ensures that there's a balanced assessment. So we're not just looking at a historical drug use. We can also look at recent drug use as well. And it prevents any misinterpretation. So someone providing a negative urine sample to a court doesn't necessarily mean that the person is drug-free. It could just be that they've abstained from drug use for the last 4 days. So by doing both together, it kind of shows that full picture of exactly what someone's use has been. And now I'm going to hand over to Sam, who's going to talk you through our reporting.
From this point on, we'll be walking through the key sections of an expert report. This part of the presentation is designed to show how we present and interpret toxicology findings for court use, and how we ensure each report is robust, impartial, and legally defensible. So there are two formats we use for reporting. The first is a certificate of analysis. So this contains only the lab results with no interpretation, and is purely factual. And the second, and most popular, is the expert report. So this includes the interpretation and any contextual information. And these reports are suitable for court proceedings. Expert reports are written by trained toxicologists. They're impartial and independent, and they follow Part 25 of the Family Procedure Rules. They are designed to be practical and readable for non-scientific professionals, such as judges, solicitors, and social workers. In this section, we explore the use of head-hair drug testing and its interpretation using a real-world example. So this specific case was tested for cannabis and cocaine for a period of 3 months, segmented month by month, so 3 by 1 centimetre sections. So first after the title page is the conclusion. So this is one of the most important pages in the report, and this is why it's placed as the first page straight after the title page. It provides a clear summary of the findings, for example, whether drug use was indicated during the period analysed, or whether the results were negative. We include any relevant commentary here, for example, whether results are consistent with repeated use, whether they show evidence of cessation, or they suggest a particular pattern. Language here is always evidence-based and non-judgmental. And if factors such as cosmetic hair treatments or any other external influences may have impacted the results, we ensure this is clearly highlighted in our interpretation. Then we have the request of analysis table. So this table shows exactly what was requested at the time of instruction, includes the sample type and length, the substances or drug groups requested, and how many months were to be analysed. It confirms whether the analysis aligns with the original instruction, and if not, we explain why, such as insufficient hair length, for example. This just ensures transparency between what was asked and what was delivered. Then we have the donor and sample information. So this section includes the sample donor's full name and date of birth, plus the sample collection and receipt dates. It also records who collected the sample, confirms whether the chain of custody was intact, and includes a photograph of the sample donor as well as whether photo ID was provided. And if there are any issues, like an unclear chain of custody, for example, we contact the instructing party. And if it can't be resolved, then a recollection may be necessary. Then we have the sample donor disclosure section. So these are declarations made by the sample donor at the time of sample collection. So they include things like drug use history, prescribed or over-the-counter medications, potential environmental exposure to drugs, and cosmetic hair treatments like dyeing or bleaching. And this information is critical when interpreting the results. So, for example, if environmental exposure is declared, the wash samples are retained for 3 months for testing if requested. And in certain cases, the wash samples can help differentiate between external contamination and systemic cocaine use, for example, by identifying the presence or absence of drug residues on the hair surface, thereby supporting a more robust interpretation of the results. Then we have the drug analysis and results table. So this section presents the lab data in a clear and readable format. It shows each segment's results and the corresponding approximate time period. We explain here what the concentration ranges mean and note any results above the cutoff, and these are classified as positive results. And anything below the analytical cutoff is reported as negative. So this is where you can often see trends in drug use, such as rising or falling concentrations across segments. And this particular case study involves segmented hair analysis to detect cocaine and its metabolites. At the time of sample collection, the sample donor did not declare the use of any cocaine. But as you can see in hair segment S3, it tested positive for both cocaine and the primary cocaine metabolite, benzoylecgonine or BZE, above their respective cutoffs, with a BZE to cocaine ratio greater than 5%, which is indicative of drug metabolism, i.e. the drug breaking down in the body, and therefore direct use of the drug. Segment S2 showed cocaine alone above its cutoff with no BZE, meaning we cannot definitively confirm use just based on this segment alone. However, this segment corresponds to a time the sample donor has disclosed bleaching their hair. So bleaching itself can affect more polar metabolites like benzoylecgonine when compared to cocaine. And cocaine is more stable in the hair shaft. So the hair segment S2 specifically matched the visual colour change observed in the hair sample at about 1.2 centimetres from the root cut end. So in this case, although benzoylecgonine wasn't detected above the cutoff in hair segment S2, it's plausible that it had been degraded due to the bleach, which supports in this instance that cocaine was likely from use within that time period or prior to the approximate time period covered by that segment, i.e. previous use of cocaine. Segment S1 tested negative for cocaine and its metabolites, and there was a reduction, as you can see, in the concentrations of cocaine and benzoylecgonine from S3 to S1, which possibly indicates cessation of cocaine use over time. So the learning points here are to consider cosmetic hair treatments like bleaching when interpreting results, as they can distort the concentrations, patterns, and impact metabolite detection. Rely on metabolite ratios when present in terms of interpretation, and treat cocaine-only findings with caution and contextualize them using surrounding segment results and client disclosures. So the other information included in our expert report include the qualifications and declarations. So this section establishes the credibility of the reporting scientist, includes their name, qualifications, and a statement confirming independence, so no conflict of interest. And this just provides reassurance to the court that the interpretation has been carried out by a qualified impartial expert. Then we have the tech information subheadings. So we include technical note at the end of every expert report for transparency and scrutiny. So these cover a number of areas. So includes the information about the drugs requested, includes the hair growth phases and rates. So we work on an average growth rate of 1 centimetre per month, which is conservative and standardised. And it's widely accepted across the industry because it fairly represents all ethnicities and hair types and supports consistent interpretation across all cases. Then we have elements such as the drug incorporation into hair. We have the range of drugs detected and what that means. Then we have the external exposure and washing procedures. And then we have information about cosmetic hair treatment and thermal hair straightening. Then we have information about the cutoff values. So this is a particularly important section because it highlights that we use both analytical cutoffs and Society of Hair Testing cutoffs. So the SOHT's cutoffs are internationally recognised, peer-reviewed standards agreed by global experts. So these help us classify results as positive or negative while accounting for measurement uncertainty. So together, the Society of Hair Testing thresholds and the analytical cutoffs that we use help us ensure results are accurate, fair, and defensible in court. So altogether, this technical section demonstrates that our reports are thorough, scientifically grounded, and complying with ISO 17025 UCAS accreditation. And now I'll pass you back to Ashley, who will take you through alcohol testing.
Okay, so we've spoken about options for drug testing, and now we're going to look at options for alcohol testing. So similarly to the drug testing, when we look at alcohol, we would look first of all to do a sample of head hair. And when we use that sample, we're looking at chronic and excessive consumption of alcohol. And what that means is the World Health Organization would deem chronic and excessive consumption as more than 7.5 units of alcohol being consumed on average on a daily basis for over 2 or more months. So that's what we're looking at when we're doing this testing. We can test for chronic and excessive consumption, as I just mentioned, but we can also test for abstinence over a period of time, depending on the sample type available from your client. So again, and I know I've said it before, it's about considering what you are looking to prove before ordering the testing, what sample would be the best option, whether your client has a valid sample, and then what type of results you're looking to prove. So when we're looking at alcohol testing in head hair, we still need to allow that 14-day growth, just like we do for drug testing, from ingestion to it being available in the sample. And when we look to test head hair, we look for 2 markers. So we test for ETG and for ETPA. And we always test them together where possible because they complement each other quite well. And we're going to look at the benefits and limitations of both of those types of tests. So for the ETG testing, ETG is water soluble. And what that means is that certain hair cosmetic treatments, such as bleaches, dyes, and perms, can potentially decrease the levels of ETG that are found in the hair. And this is why in certain circumstances, courts will state to clients to not use any cosmetic treatments on the hair between the order and the testing taking place, so that it can't negatively affect the testing. This is why we would always ask this question at the point of collection. So when we take the sample, we go through a series of questions, which include any cosmetic or heat hair treatments that have been used during the testing time frame, so that, as Sam said, they can be taken into consideration when writing a report. Now, ETPA isn't water soluble, it's fat soluble. So it is affected, but by different things. So ETPA is affected by hair styling products that contain alcohol. So things like your hairsprays, gels, waxes, and this can increase the level of ETPA found in the hair sample. And this is why the Society of Hair Testing don't recommend testing ETPA for abstinence. And we always recommend doing ETG and ETPA together where possible. So much like your head hair testing for drugs, when we look to test for alcohol in head hair, we apply that same rule of a centimetre per month. And this is why we're allowed to test for up to 12 months using up to 12 centimetres of head hair. And this table here just shows what analysis is available to you if you instruct this type of testing. So for all of the tests that we've just discussed, we can report them all up to 12 months, and we can either segment them month by month or provide an overview report of this. We recommend that between 3 and 6 months is the ideal sample length to be looking at, but we can test up to 12 months when required. If we're testing for ETG and ETPA together, we're looking for excessive consumption or chronic and excessive consumption. If we're testing ETG only, we can also report on abstinence. So again, it's something to bear in mind when ordering the testing as to which would be the most suitable for your client and their circumstance. If head hair isn't available, we are able to use other samples. So we can test body hair for ETG only, and that would look for abstinence and chronic and excessive consumption. Once again, we'll take what body hair is available with the exception of underarm hair, because we cannot use underarm hair for alcohol analysis. So again, something to bear in mind when finding out if your client has a sufficient sample. We can use beard hair. up to prove up to 12 months as an overview. Again, based on the length, we'd have to measure that in the laboratory, but we can't look for abstinence in beard hair. It would only be chronic and excessive consumption. And then we can look to use nail clippings. So again, fingernails or toenails covering 6 or 12 months as an overview. And this would be able to be reported as abstinence or chronic and excessive consumption. But you would need that expert report with any nail analysis that you instructed. We can also offer alcohol testing through blood. So if your client didn't have an available sample that we just discussed, we could use a blood sample to offer alcohol analysis. And there are 4 different types of blood testing that we can offer. So the top one, the PEth, the one that we would recommend, we'll come on to in just a moment because we're going to look at that on a separate slide. But we also offer CDT, MCV and LFT testing, all of which test for chronic and excessive consumption, and then ETG can also test for excessive consumption. It is important to bear in mind that if you do choose CDT, MCV or LFT testing, they can be influenced by other factors as shown in the recommendations column on this screen. So it's always worth doing them together, not testing them in isolation and using them as the sole proof of alcohol consumption. If we were to recommend one, we would always state to go with PEth testing. PEth is a direct marker of alcohol, so it's only present once alcohol had been consumed. This means that we can use it to monitor abstinence, social drinking, excessive consumption, and chronic and excessive consumption. It also means that we can use this test on anyone, so it doesn't have limitations like CDT, MCV, and LFT, where if you have a client who is pregnant or has given birth in the previous 8 weeks, they wouldn't be suitable for those types of tests because it can interfere with the results. Whereas because PEth is a direct marker of alcohol, it isn't affected by that. So you can use this test on someone whilst pregnant and shortly after they've given birth. We can also do PEth testing via the finger prick method if your client is needle phobic, so that we're able to offer it to a wider range of clients. And it's also recommended as an option if you were wanting to do repeat testing. So if you weren't looking back at someone's history long term, so up to 12 months, but you want to look at the drinking habits now, you can do PEth as repeat testing over a period of time to monitor drinking patterns or an individual's use of alcohol. So really beneficial test, and the one that we would recommend the most out of those 4. So here's a summary of everything together. We can offer breath testing for alcohol, but that is just testing the here and now, so very specific in relation to certain cases where required. Then you've got your PEth and CDT testing that covers up to a month as an overview. Your MCV and LFT, which covers up to 4 months as an overview, and then your head hair, body hair, and fingernail options that we discussed a little moment ago. Then at the bottom, you've got the option for repeat PEth testing, so taking a sample every 4 weeks, and then reporting on that to look at patterns over time. And then as some of you may also be aware, we can offer a SCRAM bracelet, so an alcohol monitoring bracelet, to detect alcohol use, and that would be from the date of fitting up until the point of removal, which would be entirely up to you how long that bracelet was on for, usually a minimum of 30 days, up to or in excess of a year for that fitting. And I'm just going to touch on SCRAM testing and what that would cover if you were to instruct it. So SCRAM testing is an alcohol monitoring bracelet. It's fitted to the ankle and it's worn continually for the whole period of time, so 24/7 monitoring. It takes a transdermal alcohol concentration, so a reading from the ankle through the skin, and then it reports that into us, who then provide that to yourselves and categorise them as low, medium or high level drinking events. It takes a reading every 30 minutes, so it's always taking readings of anyone's use so you can track it over time. And it shows that on a graph of when someone started a drinking event to when the drinking event finished, the times it run through, and then the peak reading of TAC. So it's really beneficial in cases where someone has custody of a child. For example, if they had the child in their custody, say Monday to Friday, but on the weekends they were allowed to have a drink while the child was not with them, you would see all of that through the alcohol monitoring bracelet. So it is beneficial in certain circumstances. This is what the drinking event classification looks like. So you've got those low, medium and high level drinking events. The report will also give you the peak TAC reading for each event, and then it will show you what that would mean if it was in breath, and also the typical number of alcohol units that would need to be consumed in order to trigger that drinking event at that peak TAC reading. So lots of good information if suitable for your client. And now I'm going to hand over to Sam, who's going to talk you through our report in relation to alcohol.
The alcohol test results are presented in the same structured reporting format as the drug test results. This just ensures consistency in interpretation and the layout across both types of analysis. And in this section, we explore the use of head hair and blood testing and its interpretation using a real-world example. So this case involved a 6-month overview for scalp hair for alcohol markers for chronic and excessive consumption, along with a PEth blood test. So in this case, the client disclosed 1 bottle of wine per week, no hair dye, but regular hairspray and heat straightener use. The client also declared some medication, but the declared medication in this case would not affect the ETG or ETPA or the PEth results. The ETG was reported at 40 picograms per milligram, and ETPA was also positive. So these are both above the Society of Hair Testing cutoffs for excessive consumption. PEth was also very high at 449 nanograms per milliliter, which is consistent with excessive drinking in the month prior to sample collection. So although ethyl palmitate, or ETPA, can be artificially elevated by alcohol-containing hair products like hairspray, ETG is unaffected by such products. So this confirms that there has been excessive consumption within the approximate time period investigated. So in a follow-up query in this case, the solicitor asked whether binge drinking events during holidays abroad, which only included about 2 weeks of drinking events in total, could have caused the elevation in ETG and ETPA. But it was reiterated in the query response that the alcohol biomarkers reflect average drinking over the entire 6-month period. And it's not possible to specifically determine any period of binge drinking, any periods of social drinking, or indeed any periods of abstinence within the time period investigated. And PEth itself only reflects the last month prior to sample collection. So it was further noted that PEth could not be influenced by holidays with drinking events that occurred 7 or more weeks before the sample collection. So in this case, the combination of hair alcohol biomarkers and PEth testing meant that we could conclude that the disclosed binge drinking episodes alone would not account for the findings, unless such episodes were more frequent and intense than originally stated. So this is further supported by the fact that PEth remained elevated despite the binge drinking events occurring more than 7 weeks prior to sample collection. And the sample donor also only declared a typical alcohol intake of only 1 bottle of wine per week. So for further testing and clarity in this case, we advised monthly PEth testing. We advised a potential scram cam monitor for real-time tracking, and optional repeat hair testing for updated analysis windows, so to exclude the binge drinking holiday events, essentially. But the overall interpretation in this case is that there had been sustained chronic and excessive alcohol consumption within the time period investigated, and it was inconsistent with the disclosed moderate intake. So this is just an example of why full disclosure of sample history at the time of sample collection, alongside the combined use of hair alcohol biomarkers and PEth testing, is essential to ensure accurate interpretation, support a robust assessment of alcohol use patterns over time, and strengthen the reliability of conclusions by accounting for any external influences and any overlapping detection windows. And now I'll pass you back to Andrew, who will be leading the Q&A session.
Thanks very much, Sam, and to Ashley too for your presentations there. Appreciate that there's a lot of information to take in there, but as I mentioned at the start, we can send out an information guide to you which has a summary of all the tables that you've seen in the slides today. You'll also receive an email tomorrow with a link to a recording of the webinar today if you want to watch anything back as well. Okay, so we've got another 5 minutes. We're just going to answer a few questions that were asked during the registration period. As I said earlier, if you have any other questions you can think of now, then please add them to the Q&A function on the Zoom technology. And even if we don't get time in the next few minutes to answer them, we will send you a personal response later on today. Okay, so the first question is for Sam. So Sam, how foolproof are these tests as clients frequently seek to challenge them?
So toxicology tests are highly robust when conducted by accredited labs like AlphaBiolabs, using validated methods, appropriate cutoffs, and chain of custody procedures. However, no test is entirely foolproof. But at AlphaBiolabs, our interpretation always considers factors like sample integrity, any possible external contamination, any individual differences, and the limitations of the biological matrix being tested. So whilst challenges can be raised, when testing is performed correctly and interpreted appropriately, the results are legally defensible and backed by international standards, including the Society of Hair Testing and UCAS ISO 17025 accreditation. So this just ensures the evidence we provide is both scientifically sound and court appropriate.
Thanks, Sam. Second question for yourself, drug testing methods. How long do different drugs stay in a person's system?
So this depends on the matrix involved. So urine, for example, so most drugs are detectable for 1 to 4 days, but cannabis, for example, can be detectable for several weeks in heavy users. Blood, it shows very recent use, usually from a few hours to 1 to 2 days, depending on the drug. Oral fluid or saliva testing is similar to blood, so anywhere between 12 to 48 hours. Hair itself provides a much longer term view. It can detect drug use over weeks to months, depending on the length of hair available. So on average, 1 centimetre of scalp hair represents about 1 month of history, and in chronic or frequent users, drugs may be detectable for up to 6 months following cessation. Nails as well offers a long detection window, up to 6 months for fingernails and potentially 12 months or longer for toenails. But unlike hair, nails can't be segmented, so they reflect overall exposure during the entire period of growth. But detection times itself can also vary by drug class, dose, frequency of use, metabolism, and individual health status.
Thanks, Sam. Third question is for Ashley. Ashley, question here is, testing should not be the defining aspect of a case, yet in the family court, a statement of use is rarely provided. Why don't testers insist on such a declaration before testing?
So it is included as part of the collection process that we ask a number of questions. So we ask obviously about cosmetic hair treatments. We also ask about any drug use or medication that's been taken during the testing time frame. We ask about any potential exposure, both environmental and with other drug users. We can't force anyone to declare their drug use over that period of time, but we do ask all of those questions. And then if the person providing the sample opts in, they also get a copy of that and they can amend it within 48 hours of the submission of the sample. So we do our best to get an honest report from every donor about any use before the collection, but obviously it's entirely up to them whether they disclose that or not.
Thanks, Ashley. Okay, next question, a couple more. Sam, how quickly does abstinence from drugs or alcohol show on test results?
This is similar to the previous question in terms of it's matrix dependent. So for example, urine and blood, it can reflect abstinence within days. For instance, with benzodiazepines, this may clear in 2 to 7 days, and cannabis in light users may clear within 3 to 10 days approximately. Oral fluid reflects very recent use, so abstinence is usually reflected within 12 to 48 hours. PEth, which is used for alcohol, takes longer. After stopping drinking, PEth can remain detectable for anywhere between 2 to 4 weeks, especially after heavy or frequent consumption. In hair testing doesn't show immediate abstinence. It's because it takes about 2 weeks for new hair to grow out from the follicle and appear above the scalp, as Ashley mentioned previously, which is the part we test. So the first alcohol drug-free segment doesn't appear until at least 2 weeks after stopping. And results reflect an average over time, so there's no specific dates. And in chronic users, markers can remain detectable in multiple subsequent segments due to accumulation or slower washout. And then with nails, nail testing is even slower to reflect abstinence. So drug-free growth typically starts to appear in fingernails after about 2 to 3 weeks, and in toenails after about 3 to 4 weeks or more. And it can take several months for previously exposed portions to fully grow out and be trimmed.
Thanks very much, Sam. And one final question before we conclude the Q&A. Again, for yourself, Sam, is PEth testing ever a suitable testing option to be done in isolation, such as to show a month-by-month analysis? And what are the benefits of undertaking hair strand testing as well?
So PEth testing in isolation may be appropriate for assessing alcohol consumption in the prior 4 weeks to that sample collection, particularly if recent consumption is in question. So whilst PEth is not segmentable like hair, monthly PEth testing can effectively reflect a person's average alcohol intake over each approximate 4-week period, allowing month-by-month trends to be tracked over time. So this makes PEth suitable for, say, monitoring ongoing drinking behaviour, particularly in abstinence or relapse monitoring programs, for example. Whereas with hair strand testing, this can be segmented, i.e. into 1 centimetre sections, to provide a month-by-month history over a longer time period, say up to 6 months, for example. So using PEth in combination with hair testing offers both a short-term and long-term view of alcohol use. So this strengthens the overall evidence base and mitigates any limitations of either method in isolation, essentially. So PEth, for example, has a defined blood half-life of between 4 to 10 days, whereas ETG and ETPA in hair persist until the keratin sheds naturally. So it makes them long-term markers without a true half-life in those matrices. So one key advantage of combining both is that ETG and ETPA in hair cannot be rapidly eliminated, and they reflect longer-term alcohol use, whereas PEth is eliminated more quickly after drinking ceases. So a change in PEth concentrations across cereal samples, for example, may help demonstrate whether drinking behaviour has changed recently, even before this is reflected in the hair growth.
That's great. Thanks very much, Sam. Okay, we've had 3 more questions come in during the Q&A. Unfortunately, we won't have time to answer that now because our time is up. But as I say, thanks to those, well, all of you that have asked questions either before or during the webinar. We will send responses later on to those who have asked a question and haven't had an answer yet. Okay, so that concludes the webinar this morning. Hopefully you found that of use. There will be a very short survey that will appear on the screen once we log off. Please could you take a minute to complete that? Your feedback to us is really invaluable for the planning of future webinars. Also, I mentioned that if you want, we can provide you with the brand new information guide, which summarises all the testing options that Ashley and Sam have talked about this morning. Through the survey, you can request that as well. There is a question at the end where you can say whether you want electronic or a hard copy being sent to you. And like I said earlier as well, you will receive a follow-up email tomorrow with a link to the recording of the webinar. And from that email, you can also request either an electronic or hard copy of the brand new information guide as well. So all that remains for me to say is thank you very much to Ashley and Sam for their presentations. Thank you to all of you for your time this morning. Please do get in touch with us. We are the experts in drug, alcohol and DNA testing. You can see our methods of contact on the screen there, including social media, where we're on LinkedIn and X. If you're on there, then please do look us up, give us a follow. We'll follow you back. Thanks very much again, everybody. Have an enjoyable day, and we look forward to seeing you soon on the next AlphaBiolabs webinar. Thank you and goodbye.